Truth. The concept of truth has been under siege for decades, if not centuries. In fact, several years ago, there was a survey that was done of different age adults in our country. And really, the conclusion that kind of ran the spectrum of those ages was that more than 50% of adults in this nation no longer believe there was such a thing as absolute truth. I hope that changes. And if you have a conversation with someone who makes a statement, there is no such thing as absolute truth. Truth is always subjective. Truth is always relative. There is no such thing as absolute truth. Ask them if they're absolutely certain of that, because they're making an absolute statement. If there is no such thing as absolute truth, they cannot be absolutely sure that there is no such thing as absolute truth. They've actually proven that concept of theirs to be illogical, irrational, inconsistent. And somebody that holds on to that, maybe holding on to it tenaciously, falls into that category of thinking about this illogically, irrationally, inconsistent. And that's not a criticism, that's just the truth. In the New Testament, John writes about truth really more than any other writer. Paul comes close, but you have to take all 12 of those letters where Paul uses his name in the salutation as he's addressing congregations, individuals, all 12 of them together, to come really close to the amount of times that John uses the word truth in the Gospel of John, in the very short letters of 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John, and the end of the New Testament. But as far as the book goes, there are more examples of the word truth being used in the Gospel of John than any other single book in the New Testament. It's got to be significant. The next time we're together, I want to talk about the pros and cons of individuals that say there is truth, or really I'm not sure that there is, and how does that kind of fit into the scheme of things. But on this occasion, at the time we have together now, I'd like to talk about the way that John uses that. And even though there are 25 times in the Gospel of John that John uses that, we're obviously not going to talk about all 25 of them. But I want to actually mention several of them, and hope that you dig through the rest of them. Beginning in the very first chapter of John chapter 1 and verse 14, in the introduction that he has to the life and ministry of Jesus, John writes this: "The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. The glory is of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth." Just a few verses later, verse 17, he mentions that grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. That being the case, to begin with in this chapter, how do you find that in the rest of these chapters? Well, it shows up next, really, in the conversation Jesus has with Nicodemus, the individual that's among the rulers of the Jews. Nicodemus comes to Jesus by night. And in verse 19, 20, 21, this is what Jesus says. "This is the condemnation. The light has come into the world, and men loved darkness rather than light because their deeds were evil. Everyone practicing evil hates the light, does not come to the light, lest his deeds should be exposed. But he who does the truth comes to the light, that his deeds may be clearly seen, that they have been done in God. If I'm following what is true, I have nothing to hide. If I'm living by true precepts, I have nothing to hide. If I have a motivation of selfishness and greed and evil intent, I do not want people to know what I'm doing. I'll be saying one thing and doing something else." Truth, living by truth. To keep that thought in mind and go to the very next chapter, chapter 4, and Jesus is talking to a woman of Samaria, a Samaritan, not a Jew. And she's amazed to begin with that a Jew would even talk to somebody that's a Samaritan. There was ill will between the Jews and the Samaritans. They have a tremendous conversation that covers several different topics. And then Jesus says in verse 23 and 24, "The hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth." That doesn't really sound like a relative, subjective kind of statement. That really sounds like what Jesus is saying is there are certain things that really need to be followed. And that holds true whether we're talking about his assessment of the person who follows truth in chapter 3 or the person that worships truth here in chapter 4. In chapter 5, in verse 33, referencing John, the one who prepared the way for the ministry of Jesus, Jesus makes the statement in verse 33 of John chapter 5 that John bore witness to the truth. Again, a concept that seems like it has a very valid sense to it, not something that's kind of nebulous, not something that is relative, subjective, but something that validly has specific details associated with it. Which brings us to chapter 8 of John. John chapter 8 and verse 32 is one of those verses that most people recognize in connection with truth. But a lot of individuals don't realize that it's only half of that thought. The thought that Jesus is expressing begins in verse 31. Verse 32 by itself makes sense, but verse 31 and 32 together heighten that meaning. Here's verse 32. You shall know the truth shall make you free. In a lot of English translations, you'll find verse 31 and 32 not separated by a period, but a semicolon. Those translators recognize this was a continuous thought. So hear those two verses together. Then Jesus said to those Jews who believed him, if you abide in my word, you are my disciples indeed, and you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. If you're taking those principles and applying them into your life and seeing the validity of them, you're going to know the truth of them. And it's that actually makes you free. But the examples of truth don't just end with this particular verse. If you continue in this same chapter, Jesus references in verse number 40 that even at that point the Jews wanted to kill him. But now you seek to kill me, a man who has told you the truth, which I heard from God. I told you the truth, and you want to kill me because of it. In fact, later on in verse number 42, if God were your father, you would love me, for I proceeded forth and came from God, nor have I come of myself, but he sent me. Why do you not understand my speech? There's the answer, because you are not able to listen to my word. And it's not as much an inability as a willful ignorance. I do not want to concede the fact that I may be wrong about my conception of the Messiah, that I may be wrong about an earthly kingdom that God's going to establish and bring the golden age of Israel back among the nations of the world. We'll talk about that concept a little bit later on. There's a statement that Jesus makes down in verse 45 and following. Because I tell the truth, you do not believe me. Which of you convicts me of sin? Verse 46. And if I tell the truth, why do you not believe me? The conclusion, along with another question, verse 47. He who is of God hears God's words, and therefore you do not hear because you are not of God. Back in the middle of these verses we just mentioned, in this chapter, John chapter 8, down in verse 44. Ye are of your father, the devil, Jesus says, and the desires of your father you want to do. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth because there is no truth in him. When he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own resources, for he is a liar and the father of it. No wonder these individuals want to do things in the darkness. And they're not even considering the fact that they may have misunderstood some of those principles that they believed that they were following from the Old Testament. And Jesus points out over and over again through that earthly ministry that they have actually missed the whole point of those precepts that was given to the nation of Israel. There's another statement about truth that's very familiar with people, and it's in chapter 14. John chapter 14 and verse 6. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. I am the way, the truth, and the life. John chapter 13 through chapter 17 we've talked about before cover just one night in the ministry of Jesus. And this is right in not really in the middle of it, of course, the beginning of it. But Jesus has told them, I'm leaving, but I want you to love one another, and I want you to understand that I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. In that same setting, the same long statement that Jesus makes on that same evening in chapter 17 of John and verse 17, concerning God, he says, your word, God's word, is truth. And people today that say, well, truth is relative. It's not absolute. It's subjective. Which one of the precepts of God's Word that talk about the way that we need to live in relationship to each other, humanity, do you consider to be invalid and not truthful? Is lying okay? Is being arrogant okay? Is being deceptive okay? Is envy and jealousy and coveting what somebody else has okay? Which precept and principle that Jesus taught in that ministry that you read of in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are you going to say is totally invalid? Looking at the context of what he says and how he says it, it's totally invalid. So that's not going to be something that's absolutely true. That's something that I can actually change whenever I want to. Does that make any sense? So individuals that say there's no such thing as absolute truth fall into that kind of category. Well, I'll be kind to people as long as it suits me. I'll be honest as long as I can't get away with dishonesty. You can see the ramifications of all of these things. I want to talk about one more passage where truth is mentioned. Really kind of ties some of these thoughts together. It's in John chapter 18. In John chapter 18, beginning in verse 33. Then Pilate entered the praetorium again, called Jesus, and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered him, "Are you speaking for yourself about this, or did others tell you this concerning me?" And you can hear a tone of being kind of irate in the way that Pilate responds. Verse 35, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I should not be delivered to the Jews, but now my kingdom is not from here." I think there are a lot of religiously minded people that need to listen to Jesus say, "My kingdom is not of this world," because he says that twice in this answer. Pilate therefore said to him, "Are you a king then?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this cause I was born, and for this cause I have come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." Truth again, used more than once. And then Pilate's statement, actually a question, verse 38. Pilate says, "What is truth?" Not what is the truth, but what is truth? What is truth as a concept? Back in the early 1940s, Linsky, in writing his commentary on John, made an observation that sounds like it was written yesterday. I'd like to read you what he says. He says nothing further about Jesus' kingship, nor does he dwell on other points of Jesus' reply. He, talking about Pilate, centers on the essential point, truth. If, however, Pilate had asked in reply what is the truth, he would have asked Jesus to tell him what he meant by the specific truth of which he was speaking. Pilate is not seeking to learn about this truth, nor in fact about any religious truth whatever, and thus he omits the article. He didn't say what is the truth, but what is truth. The tone is that of an indifferent worldling who by his question intends to say that anything in the nature of religious truth is a useless speculation. His word is not one of contempt, for the sequel shows too plainly that Pilate was deeply impressed by Jesus. His word is simply that of the practical pagan skeptic. The educated Roman world had many men of this type. They had no faith in their own gods, although they continued the usual idolatrous rites. They were inwardly indifferent, cold, and haughty, and adjusted themselves to an immoral world with an eye only to what they might selfishly squeeze out of such opportunities as it offered. That doesn't sound like the 1940s, that sounds like 2020. He continues. Pilate, however, is not one of the worst type. While he thrusts Jesus from his heart, he does not fight him or fight his truth, as so many of these worldly skeptics do. And I think you could add the word today at the end of that sentence. Very astute observation. Written initially in 1943. But it fits what you hear on television. It fits what you read in the paper. People haven't changed. The same hatred that turned away from God and has over the centuries, the same hatred that crucified Jesus, the same hatred against finding and following what is right and what is true exist within this world, seemingly in an ever greater way. And I pray that that changes. Next time we're together, positives and negatives, the way people look at truth. Please stay safe. We'll talk again soon.